a few tech notes. Closed captioning is available on Zoom. So if you'd like to turn captions on or off, you just go to the bottom of your Zoom screen and choose to either show or hide subtitles. For those of you who are on Zoom, we are going to be using the Q&A question tool. So if you've attended some of our webinars in the past, you may know that we often start out with a presentation or sort of an introduction, and we'll hear from Kevin about his background, but really then we're going to jump into this being a live Q&A. So the Q&A tool is going to be really valuable. If you are watching from YouTube, welcome. We're happy to have you here today. You can use the chat function in YouTube, and we have a team of wonderful colleagues, Mark, Leanne, and Sarah, who are behind the scenes helping relay your questions and answer your questions and share what you are curious to learn about. So use the Q&A tool in Zoom to ask your questions, and in YouTube, use the chat function. In Zoom, the chat is only going to be used in case something major happens from like a tech standpoint. And that way you can tell me your sound went out or your video isn't working. And we're going to be sharing plenty of links there because there's going to be lots of information we're covering, and we want you to be able to check out that information on your own afterwards. We always get this question, so I'll just go out ahead and answer it. We are not able to send a list of, we cannot send the chat for privacy purposes. So if there's a link that you're really excited about, open it up and make sure you bookmark it or take a screenshot of the chat so that you can save that. We are recording this video, this webinar. So if there's something that you miss or you want to make sure you're following up on, you'll have a chance to watch it again. It will be posted on the Bird Academy Open Lectures page, which we'll put a link to in the chat. And you can, we'll be sending an email out with the recording to those of you who registered over Zoom. So we are excited today to talk with Kevin McGowan, and let's jump into things. So Kevin, welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Always good to be here. Fun to talk birds. I love to talk birds.
Right? I know, it's so fun. And this time of year is pretty magical. So before we get into everyone's questions, which we got so many great ones pre-submitted, would you mind telling us a little bit about who you are and what your background is and how you landed getting asked to do this webinar?
Sure. I'm a professional ornithologist. That is, I study birds and I teach people about birds. And I've been lucky enough to do that for a long time now. I got my PhD working at the University of South Florida, working with Florida scrub jays, looking at the development of social behavior in young jays. When I moved to here to Ithaca to actually be the curator in charge of the bird and mammal collections in the museum, I started studying crows. And I've been following a marked population of American and fish crows for 35 years now. And I've tagged over 3,000 individual crows and followed them from nest to doom. We've had 3 birds that have lived to be 19 that I've followed, that I knew as an egg, and got to see them into their 19th year. So wow. That's been a lot of fun. That's a lot of my interest is there. I also am interested in education. I helped start the All About Birds website, and I am interested in everything birds. I'm also a hobbyist birder, a pretty avid birder. So I'm interested in identifying them, in taking them apart and seeing what's inside, in knowing who they hang out with and why and what they eat, and parts and phylogenies and who's related to whom and all that stuff. I'm just, my interests are all over the board. And so that's why these things are so much fun that I get to talk to you on this. I should say that my main gig right now is creating courses in Bird Academy at the lab. And if you don't know about Bird Academy, look it up, because we've got over 20 courses ranging from intro birding to university level ornithology course that we have offered for people to take online. And so that's a fun job for me. And as I say, I've been getting paid to talk about birds for a long time, and this is a lot of fun.
Great. And I will put the Bird Academy link in the chat right now, because you are right. It is such an incredible resource. Lots of free courses, paid courses, courses with you, courses on everything from, nature journaling to really, to sparrows, learning how to ID some of those very tricky birds. So if you have specific questions related to things that we aren't able to cover in this 52 minutes that we have left, that's a great place for you to check out additional resources. So we wanted to make sure that we sort of kick things off talking about migration. We're into this is the time of year where we are, which is up in Ithaca, New York. And so someone actually pre-submitted the perfect question to get this conversation going, which is, what is migration and why does it happen? They asked specifically, is it food that creates the motivation to migrate? Is it breeding, other reasons?
And that's a great question. The birds move long distances or short distances, depending on the species in the part of the world where they're migrating. But some of them travel incredible distances from the Arctic in Canada and Alaska down to Argentina and Chile or to New Zealand. And typically, there are various reasons for it, but almost always the main thing is about food, because birds are pretty hardy, and there are a few species like snowy owl and willow ptarmigan that actually spend the winter up above the Arctic Circle, and all the way in northern Canada, and they can handle the cold and they can find food. Some of them can find food. Not everybody can find food, and that's the thing, is that they can handle the cold. Most little birds they've got a down sleeping bag around them the whole time in the winter, and so they can handle the cold, but they have to be able to find food. And a lot of birds, their main food is insects, right? And insects, I don't see many insects in the winter. If you like to eat insects, especially flying insects, well, then you better leave Canada and upstate New York in the winter, because you're not going to find anything. There are a few birds that are resident that actually can find it, but they're the birds that are actually pecking in the crevices and finding things like chickadees and nuthatches and some woodpeckers that are finding the overwintering larvae and overwintering adults and eggs and things like that. But the flycatchers and the ones that catch them by seeing the insects move, they've got to get out of here and go somewhere else where they're insects, or turn to some other food source. So, and it's all about the food, and it's not just any old food. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we get into some other things, but there are basically three things that birds need to do in a year. They need to breed, they need to change their feathers at least once, and they need to survive the rest of the year. And sometimes the food you need to raise babies is different than what an adult can live on. Babies can't drink beer and eat olives and stuff like that. Those things have toxins in them that an adult can handle, but a growing youngster cannot. And so it's protein is what the kids need to grow and prosper. So birds move to places where there's heavy, intense protein sources to raise the young. But then after that, they don't need so much protein, and they can do other things. And one of the things that some of the birds do is change their feathers. And some birds actually migrate to a different place than where they breed to change all of their feathers, because there's different sort of food sources that are available, different amounts of things that are available. And so you go where those are necessary, and then move on to the wintering grounds where you can get by with whatever you need. No special needs at that point. So those are the most of it. I mean, certainly some birds would die if they stayed up in the cold. They're not adapted to that, but those are sort of secondary characteristics. Most of the problems with that a bird tries to get away from have to do with food.
So I always see I see one follow-up question. Kathy F asked, I'm interested in the opposite question about migration. Why do birds who live in Jamaica, where Kathy is, for 8 months of the year go north instead of staying there?
Yep, that's an excellent question. And it's because again, food, that there's a huge resource of insects that come out in the boreal forest of Canada and up in the Arctic in North America. Same thing's true in Eurasia and Africa as well, is that there becomes a big opportunity for these birds to go exploit that. And it's not that Jamaica doesn't have nice food, but boy, if you like insects, try going to the tundra or the boreal forest in the summer, and there are more insects than you can shake a stick at. It's, in fact, I try to shake a stick at them because there's
Yeah.
so many of them around.
Mhm.
So yes, excellent question. And we used to think of this. I was raised in the Northern Hemisphere and always felt like the birds were our birds that went down and wintered with you, taking a winter vacation kind of thing. But then I realized that no, it could be they're just sort of like migrant workers that are going up to take advantage of. They really live in Jamaica, but they're just visiting us for a little bit of time because we've got resources that they can exploit. And as it turns out, it's both of those things. And it looks like a lot of the birds that have radiated into I know the neotropics best, but some of the things like the flycatchers and tanagers, it looks like there's so many different kinds in the tropics that we thought that, oh, that's where they must have come from, and we've just got a few of them that are expanding their range. I mean, we only have a couple of tanagers in North America, but as it turns out, looking at the history of the genealogy, basically, of these birds and who's related to whom and all of that, who came off faster, it looks like a lot of the things were birds that were in fact up in the North Temperate Zone, and then sort of discovered the neotropics and then stayed there and radiated into a bunch of different species.
How come there are birds like chickadees or titmouse that stay in places like upstate New York all winter long? How are they surviving?
Well, it's because they can do it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because they're finding food that the other birds can't exploit.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it goes back to, how do you find your food? Everybody's aiming for similar foods, but how do you do that? And there is a bunch of insect prey out there on the trees right now, well, over winter, that the chickadees can poke into crevices and find, that the warblers and the orioles just really couldn't. And so they go somewhere else. So birds do adapt to conditions, in some amazingly harsh conditions. And a lot of birds are resident in places where a lot of the year, nobody else would want to be there.
Mm-hmm. So we're getting a lot of questions about sort of specific birds. And is it safe to summarize by saying that specific adaptations and even preferences around food are what drive the differences between different species moving certain places? I see a question about, why do ospreys move to South America, but bald eagles don't, even though, they're sort of within a similar subset of, birds. Is it safe to say that it's really just adaptation and food preferences?
Well, yes. And I will say, take a bald eagle and osprey, they have very different, they eat a lot of the same stuff, but they do a lot of different things. And one of the things that I'll probably be bringing up several times today is that there are multiple correct answers for every evolutionary question, right? How do you do this? How do you solve this? How do you live in this place? How do you eat these foods? There are many, many ways to do it. I think about this like, okay, you're on the corner of a city block and you want to go diagonally to the other corner. Is it better to go right or to go left? And if all things being equal, they're equally viable options. But in some places, going right exposes you to tigers or something like that, and going left is clear sailing. And so then there are selective pressures. There are the ones who go right didn't make it, the ones who went left did, and so they have that. But if the tigers disappear, then that right direction is just fine again. And so then there are just millions of ways to solve the simple question of how do I find enough to eat and how can I breed?
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So how do we know when migration is going to take place? Does it vary year to year? Are there factors that go into when birds migrate? And how might we get, this is a little bit of a softball question because I have some advice for people on how to learn more on this, but I want to hear from you. How do we know when migration might be happening?
Well, migration does vary from year to year, depending on weather variables or, other things out in the environment that might be different from year to year. So there's a little bit of variation about when things might be happening. But in general, migratory birds are fairly consistent in when they make their movements, sometimes amazingly consistent down to the day, for the April 5th for 5 years in a row, somebody gets a Phoebe coming back to their place. That kind of stuff happens. So there are general patterns to watch for. And the lab does have a couple of fun tools that help with that. One of the ones is if you want to know when certain birds come through where you live, anywhere in the world, basically, eBird has a tool for that. And you can find a location and find bar charts that, again, you plug in your location and it will give you a list of all the birds that have been recorded in eBird on your, at your locality. And it will show you a diagram where the very thin line means none. If there's blank, there's none. If they're very thin, it's just a few. But if they're big bars, then they're a lot. And you can scan through those bar charts and look to see, well, I know this bird doesn't stay here and breed. When does it come through? And for here in New York, for something like an olive-sided flycatcher that breeds up in the boreal forest, they come through here in late May and the 1st of June, then they're gone. And then they come back in late September, early October, and then they're gone. And so that's a visual aid for you right there to be able to say, okay, I'm waiting for, it's the 1st of May. There's a bunch of stuff that ought to be coming in. As far as year-to-year variation goes, we have another great tool that I think has been already introduced in the chat is Birdcast, a project based at the lab that looks at migration happening now and can tell you tonight's going to be a great night. There are going to be a bunch of birds moving where you can get up in the morning and say, did anything new come in? And it'll be like, well, we estimated that there were 1 million birds that flew over your county last night. And so there ought to be a couple of them hanging around. And those are just fun tools from the lab that allow you to do that. And as I say, because eBird's worldwide, you can find it for Jamaica and Sri Lanka as well. So there is some information. Might not be as much information as there is for the US and Canada, but we're working on it. And so those are ways to think about things and to get a quick start on when does something come by my house.
Yep, great. I did put links to both the eBird bar chart and the Birdcast websites in the chat, and then a link to that upcoming Birdcast webinar, which is on May 1st, where you'll see all about, if you sign up for that webinar, you'll see all sorts of information about how you can use that tool to understand what's happening most of the time at night. So then the follow-up question, Kevin, for you is, when are birds migrating in terms of like a 24-hour daily cycle? Is there a time of day where they're most active?
Absolutely. For the long distance migrants, especially, most of them migrate at night. And it's hard to see. You can't see them very well as you go, unless you go like this and find the moon and watch them fly by.
Yeah.
Which is actually a thing that before we had radar and all these other casts, people would go out and do this. They would put a telescope up and count how many birds would cross the surface of the moon.
Wow.
in an hour. And that was where they got their data. They called it a celiometer, watching the moon and watching birds fly by the moon. It's
Oh my
pretty
goodness.
cool actually to see birds fly by the moon at night.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of birds moving at night because for various reasons, but one of them perhaps is it's safer. And because they can't forage at night, they can fly higher. They don't have to worry about where they are till they come down. Now, there are other birds that don't do that actually migrate pretty much only during the day. Some things like the hawks and vultures that they use a lot of sun-generated energy, these thermals that the sun heats up the ground and the air gets hot and it rises. And then the vultures, if you see the hawk making lazy circles in the sky, what it's doing is using that upwelling of air to keep aloft, and so these hawks can travel thousands of miles with very few wing beats because they're basically finding a thermal and going up, and then riding down till they find another thermal that takes them up again, and it's all with very few wing beats. So, and then there are other things like the hummingbirds that in North America that migrate. They need a lot of energy to migrate, and so they do a lot of foraging as they go. So they're feeding as they go along. Other things are like, okay, fly a long way, stop and sit at a stopover and feed for a couple of days, then fly again for a long distance. And some hummingbirds can do that, but they're more typically are moving just dozens of miles a day as they feed as they go along. So there are a number of birds that are like that. American crows are like that too. The ones that do migrate tend to migrate during the day and stop and feed as they go along. But different strategies, again, different strategies that they all work.
Yep. So if birds are migrating at night, how are they seeing where they're going? How do they know where they're headed? There are some wild and fascinating theories around how birds know how to get generally where they want to go. But as you were saying, sometimes, very specific in the way that they might leave on the same day, year over year. Some birds are going to the exact same location. How are they doing that?
Yeah. Well, it's a fascinating thing, and it's as you know, it's complex, but there are ways that the birds they have basically a pattern in their mind that's genetic, that it's encoded in their what we'd call instinct. But what they do with that, it's like I know when I get so much hormones flowing because of the change in daylight length, then I need to start doing something, and I'm going that way, right? And then how they deal with it is, we'll get into in a second, but I just want to make this so that you can feel it's not like they have little maps and know exactly where they're going. They have sort of the need to go somewhere at a particular time, but where they go and how it works out it's variable with the environment. So, for example, humans as animals, we have an instinct. We're genetically predisposed as babies to look at other people's faces and to try to learn a language. I mean, we can't help doing that. That's as encoded in our genes as anything about migration in birds. But what language we learn, that depends on where we're raised. And so how it all plays out in the end is a mixture of nature and nurture. And the birds are the same way. A lot of them do learn their roots. They learn the routes that they go. A very few follow their parents. But a lot of them have amazing abilities to go to someplace they've never been before. And a lot of it, again, how they do it, they have different senses. They do watch the sun and the stars, the movement of the stars. We know that the birds at night navigate by the pole star and following the way the stars move. They also have some ability to see the Earth's magnetic fields, which is a visual thing that we talked about last year about this, where they actually are these pigments in the eyes that if in a certain light level, they get an electron that gets bumped up into a different shell that puts them into a quantum state where they can actually see lines of force of magnetism, and that's amazing.
Yeah.
And so they have the ability to do some of this. They also can hear infrasound, so they can hear things that, you know, like the ocean waves potentially, and stuff like that. And then they, you know, put it all into a little package and make it work. And it's just incredible, just incredible.
It really is. And, you know, I know that there's lots of analogies about, you know, how birds do the things that they do. I'd not heard the language one, but that's so helpful. I feel like that's a really clear way to understand that, you know, there are just some things that happen, like, you know, but that the combination of nature versus nurture is then where there are the differences between
and
them.
so that's the thing that I've had on that particular argument. It's not nature versus nurture. It's nature and
nurture. You're right. Yeah.
You can't get away. There's not an organism. Well, there probably are some organisms that don't learn anything, but and are completely successful surviving. But yeah, it's you can see it could be very difficult to rely on only one of those things.
Yeah. Wow. So birds are doing a lot. They're figuring out where to go and when to go and how to go. Are there things that we can do to help birds while they're migrating? We got a lot of pre-submitted questions about, you know, are there ways that I can, you know, support them, or do they need food, or, you know, what can I do to help these tiny creatures on these long journeys sometimes?
Yeah, well, one of the things you could do is turn out your lights. And we know it can be a big problem, especially in big cities, that these birds are, you know, learned to fly at night, migrate at night before there were electric lights. And so it's pretty easy to know which way is up and when the sky is always lighter than the ground. And so that's what a lot of these is the same kind of thing that why moths come into a flame, right? Is that there's a thing in their brain that says, fly to the light, fly to the light. And when birds get into big cities with all this light, they get confused. They don't know literally don't know which way is up. And they keep having this thing attract them that they find it hard to break away from. So the lab has is part of a program with oh shoot, help me with the name of it. Lights Out, the Lights Out program, to try to get cities, especially big cities in major migration routes like Houston and Chicago, that are right on the flight lines of millions of birds moving over in migration, to try to get, especially when it's going to be a big migration night, which we can now predict to some degree, that if they can get a program to get the people to turn out their lights, that's a good thing. It can save the lives of millions of birds that would otherwise whack into windows because they're so confused they don't know what they're doing. Other things, yes, you know, if you want to support migration going through, plant native plants that will feed the birds as they come through. You know, hummingbird gardens to help the hummingbirds come through, both going north and going south. Keep your cats indoors. That's always an easy one to tell people. And yeah, providing feeders that certainly the Baltimore Orioles, when they come back or are passing through, love it that people put sliced oranges out there for them to eat and stuff. And bird feeders, you know, not a lot of birds will come of the really migratory birds will come to bird feeders, but they will. It's like right now, the white-throated sparrows are coming through here in Ithaca, New York, and the feeder outside my window's got a dozen of them underneath it. So you can provide food, water, resources for birds, and it's not going to help everything, but it'll help.
Yep. Great. So, what about outside factors like weather? What are the things that can sort of get in the way of birds trying to migrate or might help them on their journey, sort of globally?
Yeah. So birds want to save as much energy as they can. They're going to make some amazing flights and use, I mean, some birds double their body weight in fat and then burn all that fat up while they're flying in migration and then needed to get more fat. Pardon me. So anything that can help birds take advantage of, just as I said, the raptors using the updrafts to gain height so they can fly farther with less effort. The weather fronts are a big deal because birds, when they get aloft, they're not just flying, they're also kind of surfing. And you can think of it that way, is that if they have a tailwind, that's so much better than having a headwind. Some birds will fly against a headwind, but boy, they would so much rather have it behind them. And when these fronts come through, you can watch the big fronts that have, suddenly bringing up all this a cold front coming across Canada and the eastern U.S. that brings up all that warm air going up north through the center of the continent. It's again, they surf that stuff, that it's just an elevator to Canada to get those things going through. And that's why there's so many migrant birds that go through the middle of the continent. It's easier to see concentrations of migrating birds on the coasts because they run out of land and you can find them pushed up against it. But in the Midwest and the Great Plains, these birds that are going from Central and South America to the boreal forests, they've got a great chute going up that way. And yes, the birds pay big time attention to what the weather's like aloft and take advantage. And then when just like when the wave ends, if suddenly it starts coming from the north, if they're trying to head into it again, then they'll drop down and feed for a while before they need to move on.
So it sounds like there's some natural element to birds migrating in flocks or large groups, but I also see, even just in this area, huge flocks of, red-winged blackbirds or, starlings, or someone wrote in about bush tits. Like, why do some birds seem to stick together in these groups? And then what motivates them to eventually leave the group or sort of, set up their own territory, or, how do those things happen?
Yeah. Well, there are three basic reasons why we see large groups of animals. One is often about food, that they're all going and exploiting the same food resource because they can get together like that. Mm-hmm. The other is about predation, that there's safety in numbers, and a big flock of birds isn't going to attack a predator, at least there are more eyes to watch for it. And if I'm in a group of 1,000 individuals and a bald eagle comes along and it's going to take one of us, I have one chance in 1,000 of being the one that gets taken, right? Mm-hmm. So there are lots of reasons to cluster in groups. And we see this all the time, both within species, where you'll see things like Canada geese, snow geese. We see traveling flocks of hundreds of thousands of snow geese coming through Ithaca in the spring. But you also see mixed flocks of birds, like, we do see a lot of mixed waterfowl, but also flocks that hang together in the day, that you can see foraging through the woods. And I think in India, they call them hunting parties. Here we call them mixed species foraging flocks, where you'll have a flycatcher and a woodpecker and a chickadee and a nuthatch hanging together and moving through the forest together, because they get something out of it. And again, a lot of protection. And think about it, if your flycatchers eat flying insects, woodpeckers are pecking into wood for things. The chickadees are kind of moving around and looking for moving stuff, and then the nuthatches are upside down, poking in the bark as well. So it doesn't hurt them. They're not competing. Mm-hmm. They're complementing each other, and they again, the many eyes deal works, is that
Yep.
and often in some places there's a bird, usually the one that's kind of like the aerial predator or waiting for flying insects. So it's sitting around watching, and they're the ones that see the predator and make an alarm.
Mm.
And so there are advantages to that. But there are also times when you want to be alone and you need to concentrate on what you need to do, which is raise a family. They get to certain times of the year where things like bush tits or which get together in fairly large, pretty cohesive of groups during the year. But then they need to go and stop moving around a little bit and sit down on a nest of eggs. And blue jays do the same thing, that they travel around in a group of a dozen birds through the winter. And then when they're starting to breed, it's like, nope, I'm not going to hang out with you guys today. It's like, we're going to concentrate on this over here. And so a lot of birds have that difference. They have things that they need to do, and sometimes they need to be real territorial about it. And I think the red-winged blackbirds are funny because we get them here at the lab that breed around the pond. And they'll come in this monstrous group of, 100 birds or so, actually sometimes more than that. And if it's a nice day, then they spread out around the pond and they act all territorial. And they're like, yeah, you tried to come over onto my territory, buddy, I'll beat your red wings up. And then it gets cold and they're like, oh, let's all go to the feeders. And then they sit beside each other and, they cover up their red so they aren't making anybody angry. But it's just like, I remember an old Roadrunner cartoon about the sheepdog and the Wile E. Coyote that came in and punched in the, hey Fred, how you doing today? Hi Bob. And they both clock in, and then they go to their separate jobs where they're trying to being antagonistic, but then it's like, okay, we'll check it out later, let's go get a beer or something. And that's exactly what the Red Wings look like. They need to do different things at different times. And a lot of the external things work on the internal things, so that with the change of daylight length, and seeing nesting places, those actually change the hormones that are moving through a bird's body and make their reproductive organs grow in the spring. And that sends a whole bunch more chemicals going through that suddenly make the birds do different behavior. And so that's kind of it, is the situation comes together at some point where all of the hormones are right, that it's like time to stop being in a group and try to raise them young.
Okay, so that's a perfect segue into sort of the nesting conversation and how it's related to migration. So you answered the fact that migration and nesting are often tied closely together. Is that fair to say for most birds?
In some way, yeah. I mean, trying to think how to exactly where. Most, but not all migration is to go to places where you can breed, right? Or to move away from a place where you can breed in, but you can't survive there. But birds also they also do this molt migration as well, where they're moving to a place. Again, this is usually after the breeding is done, and they go to two different places in the non-breeding season. One of them so they can molt there, and then the other just because they can survive and do what they need to do. So breeding is always in the mix. It just isn't always the only reason that you go to a particular place. There can be multiple reasons to go to multiple places.
There's an interesting question here that actually I'm curious to ask, related to both migration and breeding, which is success. So Maria S. asked, what percentage of migrating birds survive their treks? And then I'm also curious to know what's nest success? What's the average rate? I know it varies across species, but is there sort of a general percentage of success?
Yeah, there is, and it's kind of scary. So the numbers I know are based on north temperate birds, like an American robin, something like that. that nest in an open cup nester of a passerine about the size of your fist, something like that.
Mhm.
Of all of the nests that are started, eggs laid in them go to young, about 75% of them get eaten. So only 25 to 30% of nests in a temperate zone, this is true in Europe as well, produce any young. And of those young that they produce, and this again is for a short distance migrant, about 8% are still left alive next year.
Mhm.
So again, you lay 100 eggs or make 100 nests, you get 25 that produce young. So you have 100 young that are produced, and then there are 8 that are coming back the next year. So.
And then when you add in human factors, those numbers, are going to continue to decrease likely, right?
Well, yeah, but I mean, birds have been dealing with this kind of numbers for forever.
Mhm.
Right. And that's why mourning doves can breed 12 times in the summer.
Right.
That they've been dealing with that, but there is a lot of successes along the way. And some of that will be, there is this thing called compensatory survival or compensatory compensatory mortality, which means that of the 100 robins that headed off, if one of them hits your window, that robin, it's not like, oh my God, that's definitely going to affect the number 8, because that robin might have been one that would have died
right
anyway.
Yeah.
And so there's just this is the thing that allows duck hunting to go on and not affect the populations, because they know that there are going to be a certain number of these young birds, especially, that die anyway.
Mhm.
And so you can essentially take a limited number of that up, and you get up to a point, and then you start affecting it. But you can actually hunt ducks to a certain level that doesn't have any effect on their population size or growth. So it's just a mean world out there, and young creatures find amazingly creative ways to die. So
yeah. So you mentioned cup nests. Nicole submitted a question in advance asking how and why there's such an incredible diversity in nest types. Are some safer than others? Are some, do we have any theories around why there's such a huge diversity among nests?
Well, again, I'll say, because there are many answers to one single question, and they're right. Mm-hmm. So is it better to be in a cup nest than a platform nest? Mm-hmm. For some birds, it's fine. Other birds, maybe they couldn't pull it off. We do know that hole nests tend to be safer than open cup nests. Mm-hmm. But the problem is there aren't that many holes out there, right? Because I mean, if I'm a cardinal, I'll just make a cup nest, right?
Yeah.
But if I'm a woodpecker, I'll just make a hole nest. But if I'm a chickadee that likes to nest in holes, I can't go bang my head against the branch and make a hole that big as I'd like to go in. They've got to find one somewhere. Mm-hmm. And that's why there's a huge amount of competition for cavity nesting birds, that you'll see bluebirds and tree swallows fighting with each other, because they both want to use that limited resource. Yep. That's why starlings were a big deal when they were introduced into the North America, because they're a cavity nester and they're aggressive. They're tough as nails. They're really strong I've skinned a couple and they're like, wow, you weigh like half again more than you should for a bird your size, and it's muscle. House sparrows the same way, also competitors for nest sites. So we know that holes are good, but the holes are limited. And that's why nest boxes work so well, right? Mm-hmm. That's why we had this whole nest box network for a while, and that now that it's in Project Nest Watch that does a lot with nest boxes, because they really work, because you're providing a limited resource for a number of species that would, and a safe resource. So yeah, different nets work for different organisms. You know, for one thing, the ones that make the big nests, and pretty much the only birds that reuse nests, are ones that are too big to worry much about predation, right? So we see things like the eagles and ospreys, and like we used to have the heron cam here with these big open nests. And the deal is that they're not that much in danger of being eaten. Whereas if you're a cardinal or a song sparrow or a bush tit, you know, there is a risk of that, and you need to hide your nests, and typically birds don't reuse their nests because it's already a known location. Right? So they want to mix it up. And again, you can only reuse your nest if you're big enough not to get eaten easily.
Right.
And even crows, American crows weigh 500 grams. That's 2 pounds, and they're pretty good sized birds, but they never reuse a nest, except in odd locations where they're like in urban Seattle, where there's not enough nest sites. But around here in Ithaca, I've never had a crow reuse a nest, because there's still a risk. They still get depredated, and so it's a risk to go back to a place that everybody knows where you're nesting.
Yeah. Wow. So if there's a nest left over from another bird, like if a crow abandons a nest, I don't know, they're pretty big. That's hard to make a swap, but would another bird that's like, oh, look at this empty nest.
Absolutely.
Maybe I'll use this.
Absolutely. There are two types of common birds that you know about, that fairly large birds that do not construct their own nests. They do not make nests, and that's owls and falcons. And so, yes, great horned owls will use old American crow nests. And merlins, the small, medium-sized to small falcon that is expanding greatly in the US and Canada over the last decade, they love old crow nests. And here in Ithaca, we've got fish crows, which are a smaller version of, it's a southeastern US endemic that is about half the size of an American crow. And they make really, really good nests. And they're expanding up from the south. Now, merlins are actually expanding down from the north. And so we've got here in Ithaca pretty much the first time that merlins and fish crows have ever interacted before. And the merlins love fish crow nests. And they started off using the old ones, the ones from last year, but now they started actually attacking some of the fish crows and some American crows too, trying to get them off the nest to abandon it so they can nest in it.
Wow.
And in fact, a sad story, the oldest crow that we've ever known, I knew her as an egg, and she was a breeder at 4 and bred for 15 years that we followed her. So she was 19, and she was sitting on eggs, and a pair of merlins came in and actually harassed her off the nest and took over the nest. And she started to build a new one, but then she disappeared.
Oh, no.
We never saw her again.
Huh.
So, yeah. Makes me like merlins less than I did before.
Yeah.
I still like merlins, but
Right. So because you're a crow person, is that someone asked a question about crows shrieking at really large mammals like deer. Are they actually worried about that kind of predator, or is that just something else going on?
Well, I'm not sure. Crows do have a lot to say about predators, to the predators, filthy predator.
Yeah.
Do a lot of mobbing, as we call it. And but deer, I'm not sure what they would have any interest in deer. They do pay attention to foxes and and cats, especially when they're younger out and are recently fledged. And they worry about a lot of things that they normally don't pay any attention to. But called a couple of times, been with a companion and heard something out the window. And I said, oh, the crows are mobbing a fox. And we go to the window and there's a fox running by, because it's
Yeah.
not the same thing as they say to a great horned owl. It's a little more subdued and a different tone.
Interesting.
But I'm not sure. Sometimes crows will also mob places where they've seen where there's certainly a dead crow, they would mob heavily, but also other large dead birds that they'll. And so I don't know if the deer had anything to do with something like that, or it's hard to say exactly, because I'm not sure why a crow would be mad at a deer.
Yeah. I thought it was a fun question I wanted to ask. We have so many questions here. I mean, they're excellent. I'm so sorry we won't be able to answer all of them. We only have about 7 minutes left. So Kevin, what do you have any thoughts on, should we cover feathers? Should we talk a little bit about bird song? Any preferences on, I mean, we could really talk about anything because there are so many excellent questions that really do sort of.
Well, why don't we talk about feathers a little bit? Because there's some interesting patterns in there that most people might not know.
Yep.
Feathers are like our hair and our fingernails. They're dead substance, but they don't keep growing, right? So, but they're made of the same material, keratin, and they wear out. Feathers are important for birds for a number of reasons. One is that it helps them fly, right? It makes them sleek and aerodynamic. The feathers in their wings actually move the air to make stuff happen, and they eventually wear out. So the birds do have to replace them at least once a year. Some birds do it 2 times a year. Other ones, like goldfinches, they're replacing bunches of body feathers all the time. It's kind of weird. And so I already mentioned that when they need to molt, some birds go places where the food is really good for them to molt. But not everybody does that. And somebody I saw in one of the questions asked is this a big deal? Is this another stress on a bird's life? And yes, it is. That molting is a very significant portion of a bird's life. And as I said, it's one of the 3 things that needs to be done. You have to change your feathers at some point.
Yeah.
Now, there are a couple of things that go in with this. One is that it's, it takes resources to do it. And the other is that you can make good things out of it. So it's like, oh, I can change from, a dull and camouflage thing into big and showy bird for breeding season. And then you can say, whoops, breeding season's over. I want to make myself as less conspicuous and then molt into something else. So you can change your appearance. But it does take resources and it takes time. And when you think about it, a bird's wing, if it has a hole in it, it's not as effective at moving air. And so how do you do that? How do you change all of the feathers in your wing without seriously affecting your flight capabilities?
Right.
Most birds do it by changing only like one at a time. So there'll be one secondary on the back part of the wing and one primary up in the hand part. And there'll only be a small gap. But that means that it takes time and resources, so you're gonna have to spread it out all over the place. But most birds do that. But sometimes if they're things with really long wings, like vultures or some of the seabirds, like albatrosses, they've got such a long wing. They have so many feathers to replace that they can't do it all in one molting season. And so they have to do what we call suspend molt. And you can see on an albatross's wing, you can see a record through the mostly secondaries, of which there are, I don't know how many, a couple dozen. You can see waves of different colors in the wings. You can see this in a turkey vulture's wings pretty easily too. Some will be dark and some will be lighter, and those are older feathers. The lighter ones are older feathers from a previous molt cycle that didn't get done. And so then when they come back in molting again, they'll start there and molt through those. So it's a real interesting way to do that. Now, if some birds don't mind not being able to fly for a given period of time, and these would be the water birds, the birds like ducks and geese and grebes and loons that can swim for a month, right, when they do that. And so that's what ducks do, is is the males, as soon as the males help the female find the dabbling ducks mostly, find a nest site, protect her while she's doing it. And then when the chicks hatch, the males leave. And so they go to places where sometimes gather up together, and they molt all of their flight feathers all at once. And they also molt all of their body feathers, the showy body feathers, into a really dull plumage. And then that's how they take care of that, is, okay, I can survive swimming around for a month. I don't have to be able to fly. And then they can do it all at once. So it's a different strategy than a lot of other birds are able to partake of.
It's incredible. And I can't actually believe that we're already at 12:58. So I want to get to some of the wrap up information. There is so much more to learn. Kevin has so much more to share. And one way to learn some of that is through a link I just put in the chat, which is the Joy of Birdwatching course that Kevin leads on Bird Academy. It's an online self-paced course with so much information on these and more topics. And so that's a great way to continue expanding your knowledge. I also put a link to the sign up for additional webinars. So we have quite a few scheduled over the next couple of months that would, talk about things like these and other resources and information to help you learn about birds and biodiversity. For those of you who signed up over Zoom, we'll be sending a link out to the recording. I know we covered so much information. And so being able to watch it again, pause it, check out a link, go back and do a little research, start Kevin up again is really nice to be able to dig into some of the topics more. And I want to do a huge thank you to Mark, Leanne, and Sarah, who are behind the scenes helping answer questions. There would have been many more unanswered questions had they not been available to help relay what you were sharing and provide some context for things. So Kevin, thank you so much for taking the time. You're so knowledgeable. I've worked with you for years now, but I learned something brand new, and I always walk away from these conversations feeling extra excited about birds, even though I'm totally in that frame of mind most of the time anyways. So thank you for your incredible knowledge and your enthusiasm, and for sharing that with so many of us today.
Yeah, well, thanks for giving me an opportunity to share it. It's clearly I enjoy it, and I think it's worthwhile and fun because people love birds. Birds are cool.
They are amazing. And hope everybody can enjoy seeing some birds today. Thanks everyone, and we'll see you soon.